A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
Hello, everybody. We're here today with Dr. Gillian Smith, who directs the interactive media and the game development program at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, where she's an associate professor of computer science. Dr. Smith's research interests are in computational creativity, game design, computer science education, and the intersection of traditional crafts and computation. Her interdisciplinary work merges technical research in AI and HCI with creative practices in textiles and games, with a view towards addressing social issues and broadening participation and perspectives on computing. She earned her PhD in computer science from UC Santa Cruz, where she studied in the Center for Games and Playable Media. Gillian, welcome to the show.
Yeah! Thank you.
Oh, I miss Andy. This is another show, our second episode without Andy. Andy is usually the cheerleader at the end that welcomes our guests to the show. Once again, Andy is helping with his mother, but he'll be back with us on our next episode. All right, Gillian, we are here to talk AI. So there was a whole lot. When we thought about what this AI ethics episode should be, it was a little all over the place because there are so many directions we can go to with AI. And in fact, this may just end up being our first episode on AI ethics. One of the ways that this actually came out, and me and Andy kind of came at it from different directions, but my brother-in-law is a poker player. He's a professional gambler. And he was talking about how AIs are being used to cheat in online poker, and how it's like a really, really big deal in online poker. So I kind of wanted to start with the cheating idea. If you have any idea about this, how are AIs being used now by players to cheat against other players, or in any kind of online games?
Oh, it's tricky, right? And some of it comes down to what's the definition of cheating, right?
Good. Yes.
And where does tool assist end and cheating begin, in terms of what a level playing field is. So I will say I'm not super up to date on the latest online games and exactly what's happening in the news around AI and cheating, but for sure there's AI players in multiplayer games. I'm absolutely certain that some people are doing tool assist play or trying to do tool assist play. So yeah, it's there.
So let's break it down into two things, right? AI players as essentially, I'm playing someone that I think might be a person, but it really actually is an AI.
Yep.
And it's controlled by another player. Is that the idea?
So it's controlled by... So definitely online games will have AI-controlled players that may not immediately be obvious to the player that they are playing against an AI. It presents to the player as though they're just playing another character in the game.
Right. So notice, right, some of that obviously is just, the game is designed to make you, to simulate playing other players so you can enjoy a multiplayer experience. At what point can this be, let's say, morally problematic?
I guess to answer that, I would need to know, why would people want or not want to be playing against AI? What is it doing to the overall play experience in terms of, their stature in the game, right? So I know that some games will use AI players for, you want to be able to pick up and play right away, and there aren't players who are available to play against. So here's some AIs to play against, right?
Right.
But I don't know for sure whether that's going into, or how that's being treated in sort of game rankings, right? I would assume that it's not having an enormous effect on sort of player ranking and in the game, right? If you're playing mostly against AIs, but I don't know. It's not very transparent, right? So which I guess is part of the ethical issue, right? Does the player have the right to know?
Right. As there are some games where I really want to play multiplayer, and I'm tired of playing with the AIs. I'm thinking of Battle of Polytopia, which I play on my phone constantly, but it just seems impossible to ever play with a whole set of players because I end up waiting forever.
Yep.
I wouldn't mind a mixture of player and AI, but they don't do that. But if they did, I really would want to know who the AI is.
So why would you want to
and
know
who
who
the
the
players
AI
are.
is?
Because I play the AI all the time, you know. And if I'm going to play the players, I want to feel like, I know that I'm actually playing the players. Because I already have like a single player option where I play a bunch of AIs, right? This is a turn-based strategy game.
Right.
So, AIs are really easy. But I was thinking actually of other situations. So the example my brother-in-law essentially told me was that in poker, if let's say I'm playing poker, if some of those people around the tables are sharing the deck, if I had confederates among those people, we could essentially pass information to each other, right? And if those people are AIs, right, then they're my confederates. Then I can get information. We can share information about, let's say, what cards we have, and that gives us an advantage over other players in the game. Right. I'd imagine there's other. Games where this is the case, where essentially, if you're supposed to get a bunch of random players, but really some of them are AI controlled by a player.
Oh, I see. Right. So that's a different thing than if they're AI controlled
By the
from
company.
the company.
Right, which I asked first. Which
Right.
I understand the confusion.
Yeah, has another set of things.
Right.
I would say I don't totally know if that's happening or to what extent it's happening. I'm sure companies have a lot of rules against it. And I'm sure it's happening in poker. I'm sure it's happening in non-competitive esports. There's a lot of systems that are set up to make sure that can't happen in like competitive play esports.
Right.
Right, like the team has to all be in the same place. It has to be known who's playing what, right? Like there's league rules in place to prevent that from happening, but sort of unmoderated, I'm sure it's happening somewhere.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting that what kind of things game companies really can do to stuff like to stop stuff like that from happening. So being in person is an obvious one.
Yeah.
How do you check if how would a company check if there are AIs being used by players to gain advantage that go beyond, let's say, the aimbot? Right. So would aimbot be the tool assisted thing that you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, that would be tool assist, right? So and that's that sort of dividing line of like when does it stop being a tool, right? What skill do you want to be measuring, right? Is part of being able to play and being able to play competitively, having like your own really nicely written set of tools to be able to play. Right? Which is different. I mean, there's some things you can look at for detecting AI play, right? Like hyper repetitive behavior, spamming.
Spamming?
Yeah, so things happening in the game that are happening faster than a human would typically be able to do it, right?
Okay.
So, an AI can take actions relatively like faster than a human can. Right. So can you like try to detect that that's what's happening? And it's similar in some ways to trying to detect bots on Twitter and social media, right? Like you're looking for non-human like behavior.
Right. I think I'm thinking about Elon Musk talking about the bots on Twitter and how there's too many posts that came out way too quickly and couldn't have been done by humans because they must have been algorithmic because of the speed that they were posted in. Which is interesting because it seems like a kind of easy fix if you want to make your AI seem more human. Just give it a lag time.
Rate limit it. Yeah, in one of my classes at WPI, I actually teach AI for games, and one of the assignments that the students have to do is make a Turing test Mario. So write an AI controller for Mario that when someone watches it play, people will think is human. And then we run a little competition of like who has the most human-like Mario AI controller that they've written.
Oh my God! I'm just thinking you're helping people. That entire prove you're human. I think you're helping people. It sounds like you're helping people kind of beat that in some way.
In some way, or I'm teaching them about human behavior.
Sure.
Which is a lot of what AI people do, right? But yeah, some of the students in that class, they figure out very quickly that one of the best ways for them to make their bot seem human is to insert mistakes, is to slow it down, is to put in hesitancy, right? And a thing that sort of takes away from it looking like Mario is competent, right?
Right.
Because people will assume that incompetence is a human trait.
Well, I mean, in my case, it is.
And in my case, it is as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. So let's say the AIs are not trying to appear like people, right? And let's say they're easily accessible. They're smarter too. What are some ways that you see players potentially using AI to cheat, either now or in the future?
I mean, so certainly any kind of tool-assisted play, speedrunning is actually an interesting place to look for this, right? So where tool-assisted play of like, you know, there'll be some runs that you're allowed to have tool assistance, some that have to be just human play.
Wait, that you are allowed to have tool assistance?
Yeah, so you are
like
allowed
what?
to have tool assistance. So if you look at, oh my god, there's a speedrunning festival that runs every year. Games Done Quick, I think it's called. It's like a marathon of speedrunners. And people will, there's tracks for it where you're allowed to have AI assistance in your speedrun. Or you're allowed to have a tool assist in your speedrun to like put in, do the key presses for playing the game faster than a human would ever be able to.
That sounds like a potential spectrum. So I'm speedrunning this game. On one end of the spectrum, I'm just doing it all alone. On the other end of the spectrum, it's completely an AI is doing this
AI
for
play.
me.
Yeah.
Right. So what's in the middle here? What kind of tools? I'm even having trouble imagining the kind of tools. That's why I'm asking.
Oh, so it might be like you putting in the series of commands to be played, and then the tool, you know, spamming them fast enough to be able to actually get through the game is one example, right? So you kind of tell it what to do, and then it does it. Or maybe it, like, you reach certain points in the game, and you've got a tool that will kind of like get you past the combat quickly, or get you past some aspect of the game quickly, so that then the human will go on and do more of it. Stuff like
Okay.
that.
Oh, I see. So
Mixed
interesting.
in
The
between.
So specifically, like, there's a point where I would need to slow down, and I could have an AI tool essentially help me past that specific point, like a battle, let's say.
Potentially, yeah.
So in competitions, they might agree that, hey, let's just skip all the battle part, and we'll have the humans do the rest.
Well, and not necessarily that. It's more about like where is the skill, right? Like if we know that there are tools that are out there, and
Right.
and like using the tools can be a skill in itself, right?
Sure.
And this is where it kind of comes back to what's the definition of cheating, right?
Okay.
Is it cheating if everyone has access to the tool? Or is it cheating if we're open about what the rules are for when you're allowed to use it or not?
Right. Yeah. Interesting. Right. So we can say, look, here's our competition allows you to use any of these AI tools as long as you're sticking to the assigned tools. They're just fine. You can use them. If you end up sneaking in any of your own additional tools, that's a no-no.
A lot of the time, these tools are actually made by people in the community, so maybe it's okay if you've modified your...
So, a lot of times when we talk about cheating, it says getting an unfair advantage. And of course, the big question is, well, what does fair mean?
Right.
How does fair go in here? And you might say, look, it's as long as I did it, it's fair. And as long as I programmed my own AI, then that's fair. But
and as long as I tell you about the fact that I've done it.
Or as long as I tell you the fact that I done it. Yeah. That itself is interesting, right? So you can get an advantage, but just as if let's say we're doing a car race, a traditional car race in the real world, and you're like, yeah, my engineers came up with this great with this great thing for my carburetor. I'm not going to pretend what a carburetor does. I just kind of threw that in there. But that allows me to shave a few seconds off the lap. I might say, our team came up with this new AI, right? And then you're using AI, you're being transparent about it, so you're not necessarily cheating. But if there are potential rules about what kind of AIs you might use, and this is violating those rules, then maybe you would be cheating.
So where it gets really interesting is in things like AI competitions for play, right? So every year there's actually a couple of different StarCraft AI competitions.
Okay.
And the idea is that you want the researchers who are entering the StarCraft AI competition are trying to create an AI that can most competently play StarCraft against other AIs.
Okay.
And they had to set rules in the competition of what's allowed and not allowed in the AI play.
Why?
Right, of like what's the
Yeah.
what's the level playing ground? Well, because it's fair. We're back at what's fairness, right? Like, what information is the AI allowed to have access to? How often is it allowed to make commands, right? Is it allowed to try to knock another AI out of the competition through non-ludic play, right? Like it has to
You
play
gotta give
fair.
me an example of that. Yeah, I gotta get an example. That just sounds fun. Yeah.
So in the early days of AI playtesting, I remember this was like over a decade ago. I went to this conference and there was a paper that people were presenting about their AI playtesting tool. And they were trying to, have AI characters play the game to be able to identify where the bugs are in the game. And one of the learning agents learned that it could beat the game by forcing the game to crash under certain conditions that would count as a win against the player. And so it learned how to like engage in activity that is outside of what you would typically do as a player in the game in order to force the test to crash, right?
Like
right,
a DDoS attack?
Yeah,
or?
and essentially it like found a bug in the game's server code. By like forcing too many actions all at once.
Wow. Wow, that's cool.
So yeah, if the goal is that you're writing an AI that can participate in competitive StarCraft play or competitive anything play, it stands to reason that you would want the AI to only be taking actions that count as playing the game.
Yeah, interesting. I haven't really thought a whole lot about the idea of cheating in AIs playing each other. I want an episode just on that at some point, and we might get back to you on that, Gillian. Let's go back to an MMO. Right?
Yeah.
We got an MMO with both players and NPCs.
Mm-hmm.
Can you think of any potential reasons we might want to know? We want to make sure that players know who's a real person and who's an AI.
Yes. Real people have real feelings, right? And so you want to know if you're talking to a real life human being on the other end of things for like mitigating abuse reasons, right? People will talk to or interact with something that they know or suspect to be an AI differently from a human. Or not, right? Like maybe they treat them the same way, and that's horrifying.
Right.
But for the most part, yeah, you'll interact differently with someone who you know to be human versus.
And yeah, I mean that seems like a very good thing to keep in mind, right? And presumably, I would assume it's interesting because part of me is really interested in the possibility of really not knowing, being in a world where it's really not clear who the player controlled characters are and who the NPCs are. But if I get a level of interaction with them that could have some sort of emotional repercussions like this, it makes sense.
That sounds stressful to me to not know. And like weirdly a little dystopian, right? Like how do you know if the person you're talking to is a person?
I think it depends too if you're talking to them, right? As opposed to you're going around just shooting people, right? Then in that case it really doesn't matter.
Maybe less.
But the more you're able to have interactions, the more you're actually able to, which is interesting. This means how much are we going to enable the AI to be able to talk with you like a person would, and how much we're even keeping the ability of players of talking to each other directly versus choose responses from a menu or right. Because we're already so worried about players being brutal to each other and being toxic to each other in the first place.
Yeah, it's I guess it's like probably it matters like predicated on the extent to which you're expected to behave as though you have a relationship with the entity, right? So yeah.
Right.
I mean, to the extent that shooting someone is a relationship, I guess. Like, it's not, which is like a whole separate conversation that I'm sure you can have, right?
We're in a competitive relationship if we're in a competitive shooter. It's just not a very, it's not a very rich relationship. It doesn't have any emotional, well, I mean, as long as our ability to communicate with each other doesn't get past that.
Right.
It doesn't have any emotional context that goes kind of beyond that. We don't know anything else about each other.
And people will always find, like, one thing that's always striking to me in games, people will always find ways to communicate with each other if they possibly can through games, right? And so, if nothing else, let's say you're in, and this is like some imagined game, right? Let's say you're in some imagined multiplayer shooting game where, like, the whole thing is just open arena, like, run around, shoot people. They respawn after some amount of time into the arena again, run around, shoot people again, right? There's a number of games that are in this genre, right? If you want to harass a player, you camp on where they are and you target them and them alone. And right? Like, that's a form of communication that comes through even this, like, really non-verbal, just shooting people way of doing things, right? Like, there's a way to be able to interact with the human. And so it matters whether the entity that you are camping on and harassing is an AI or a human.
Yeah, because it seems as there's no point. Why would I waste my time harassing an AI? So as the harasser, I need to know that I'm harassing a real person.
Sure.
That's one way to
As
put
the
it,
person being harassed, you also probably want to know, right? And it would be different if it's an AI that keeps killing you over and over and over again versus another character, like another human,
yeah.
Because there are real human relationships. It's not like you stop being human beings when you go into a game, even if you never talk to each other never interact with each other outside of the context of that game. Even if there's no voice channel, even if there's no nothing, right? Like, there's no identifier that makes it so that you would know who that person is outside of this game. You're still being a human with other humans, right? I think it matters.
Let's move on to, there's a concern in almost every field about AI replacing human workers, and what their moral response to this should be. How does think this applies to the game industry? I mean, we have game designers, programmers, artists, producers, playtesters, etc. Whose jobs will AI be able to competently perform in the near future, do you think?
Perform versus change, right? So this is the eternal conversation about AI automation, right? I feel pretty confident with this. Every field within the game industry, people who work in the industry are already interacting with AI systems in some way in the course of doing their creative work, many of which a decade ago we would have said, oh, it's going to replace the people, right? So this is like the core concern of procedural content generation, right? If I've got an AI system that's going to generate all these levels for me, will I still have a job, right? Is there still such a thing as a level designer when there's procedural level generators? And it turns out the answer is yes, because there still needs to be human creativity in the process. The job just looks a little different. It's not always the case that it's like an AI helping, right? But it just changes the work that you're doing. Or like, any artist who uses Photoshop and uses like context-aware editing tools, right? Okay. Highlight this person, delete them from the scene, fill in the background with something. That's an artist who's interacting with AI in some capacity where, like 2 decades ago, they would have had to manually and painstakingly go through that process. Right. And now they work off of what the AI gives them and then like move on to the next task. It's just, it changes the tasks that they do, right? It changes the work environment that they're in.
Right. The creative, though it's interesting. I want to say the creative choice is still entirely in the artist's hands, but more and more part of me is like, well, there's all these little choices that we make along the way.
Oh, sure.
We pass on to AIs, a little bit at a time, but we still live ourselves some creative choices that we might think are maybe the more important creative choices.
More important or harder to do or outside the ability of the tool that you're using. Also, it's not like the AI is some agency carrying entity, right? The creative choice is actually being made by the people who wrote the AI system that you're using.
Right, sure.
In many ways, the most interesting AI ethics in creativity question to me right now, is how have the tools that we've got, how are they shaping the kinds of experiences that people can make, right? The kinds of creative agency that they have, either in adding new possibilities or removing possibilities, right? Like the medium is changing.
Clearly, I should have started with that.
No, it's fine. No, I'm glad I didn't have. This is like my core expertise, so I'm glad we didn't have to follow it with a bunch of things I know less about.
So yeah, tell us, what are the things that you think are really the core concerns that we should have about AI ethics, or what you think are the most interesting aspects of it happening right now or in the near future?
A few things. So let's look at things like, how do you decide what game gets to be made in the first place?
Huh.
To start
Okay.
with. Certainly, and so the industry is enormous and diverse, right? And there are always going to be studios who sort of ignore market trends, ignore market forces, right, or kind of like do their own thing and have breakaway successes in unexpected spaces, right? But increasingly, things like analytics on the App Store are going to drive creative design decisions, right?
Okay.
What's the thing?
Right.
What, like, we're watching a bunch of players play. We're running some kind of analysis on what players are currently doing and using that to decide what makes the most sense to implement moving forward in changing the game, right? What are the games that are already in the marketplace, and can we analyze like the different factors that go into making those games and use that to decide what gets made next?
It's interesting because for me, this brings up two things. Number one, it brings up the idea that the focus then might be on, what ends up getting players to spend more money. Mm-hmm. Rather than what would make for a good game, because it's much easier to track and get data and correlate essentially, game functionality to spending versus to enjoyment, because it's how you're going to track enjoyment. And the other is the remember the that job algorithm that Facebook had that turned out to be sexist.
Amazon has also had these.
Amazon's also had these,
like
right?
Built-in bias to the AI system. So that's happening all over the place, right? And not just in games by any means, but certainly in games as well. Underlying bias in the AI system that's leading to different kinds of experiences. And really, like, any game that you make that incorporates AI in some way as a player experiences it, the player is going to be experiencing the biases of the person who created the algorithm, right, in play. Right? So in procedural content generation, we'll talk about things like who gets represented and who doesn't in AI sim society type games, right? Mike Cook, who is a wonderful AI researcher and game designer, just has a couple of simple examples, right? Of like, let's say you've got a tombstone generator for a game, and you're like, I need like an entire graveyard, and the graveyard needs to have tombstones in it, and those tombstones need to have text on them, and like, I don't have a writing team to be able to write all of the text for all of the tombstones, so I'm going to write a little generator that just generates all of the things, right? Whose names in the generator, right?
Yeah,
like,
right.
What data set do you work off of for that? How do you decide what a spouse is on the tombstone generator, right? Like, do you represent same-sex marriage? Do you, right? Like, there's so much interpretation that goes into these little generative systems,
right?
That the designer of the system bakes in either intentionally or unintentionally, right? That's a big deal.
That's interesting, and that seems like such a, I want to say almost benign kind of an example, but it's a very clear example. Can you think of how this might apply? Can you give me how this might happen written larger, I guess, or, in a kind of, larger, the little names on the tombstone is really easy to understand. It's a really good example, but
Right.
what could be like, a bigger problematic, let's say?
Also, in many ways, SimCity is a really big policy modeling game, right?
Okay. In what sense?
Well, and this is so some of this is going to get back to like, what's your definition of AI, right? Where some people will some people would say it's not AI, it's design, right? But typically, like, anything that involves like complex simulation and modeling that has emergent effects, I would say is part of AI. Certainly part of game AI. So look at what kinds of policies you're allowed to create in a game like SimCity. What are the assumptions about what a city is that's baked into the design of SimCity, right? It has to have roads, it has to have, right? It has to like exist in this capitalist model, right? It doesn't let a player explore a simulation that's outside of the bounds of what the design team decided counts. And then that informs some larger conversation within a community around like, oh, look at SimCity, right? Like as a colloquial example of right, like how I learned about city management, right? And then it's like this model that is not inclusive of all potential cities that we already know about in the world.
Okay, interesting. So essentially, we have our design team. Our design team essentially brings their assumptions of what something is like. They feed a data set into something that into an AI that creates whatever city you will have in SimCity. Is that the idea, or because it's been a while since I played SimCity? Yeah.
So SimCity is more manually authored than that, and so this is also these days, I guess, when we talk about AI, a lot of the time we're talking about machine learning. But AI and machine learning are not synonymous, right? Machine learning is a tool or approach within AI, right? So SimCity is not like this. Is not like learning a city from prior data, right? It's a designer's sort of very explicit authored model of a city, right, with all of the different components and what they do to different parts of the system. For a long time, games really shied away from machine learning because it doesn't give you as much authorial control. That was the argument, right? Like game designers wanted to be able to have like tightly crafted experiences, and so they needed AI systems to be like handwritten and testable in a way that the machine learning approaches don't always permit.
Let's go back to the previous question, which was again, tell me what sort of things interest you. What sort of things are you worried about or concerned about? Yeah. I don't know, concern, worry. It doesn't need to be like there's some sort of tragedy about to happen, but yeah.
Sure. So a few examples that are going to sound a little tangential to games, but I promise they circle back.
Okay.
So there's all of this work in like AI generated art these days, right? So Disco Diffusion is one of the like pieces of software that people are using a lot, but it's all, and I should not minimize it. Like they are meaningfully different in many ways, but the essential idea is like AI system trains on a bunch of images. You give AI system prompt, it generates new art, right? Like new image based on prompt that you have given it, right? And people are already seeing things like baked in aesthetic biases, right? And you put in words that are cued as very masculine in our society, and you'll get these like gritty masculine reading things back, right? We don't have a good language yet to be able to describe the authorship and responsibility for AI created content. And people will argue about it, right? Like people will fight about it. Like the AI made it, therefore I don't need to be held accountable for the offensive thing that it made, right? Or
that's interesting.
Yeah. Which certainly is something that can come back into games, right?
Right. Oh, definitely.
And actually did. So with some of the earlier procedural generation work, which part of me can't believe is earlier, right? So look at Spore, for example. They have these procedurally generated worlds. The QA team ended up needing to make a list of what the acceptable random seeds were for generating worlds, so that the game will only generate worlds that the QA team deemed to be acceptable before shipping.
What acceptable in terms of playability or in terms of offensiveness of some kind?
In terms of playability, I'm told also a little bit in terms of like, is the shapes of all of the continents appropriate, or could it be interpreted as
Okay.
Right, but on some level, it doesn't quite matter what is meant by acceptability, right? It's the sense that like, does a human need to be the arbiter of, like, the final arbiter of what goes out into the world? Like, does a human on the design team need to be the arbiter of what is acceptable? How do you allocate credit if you're using? So let's say you like take one of these AI art tools, use it to generate a bunch of like art, right? Slap that up as paintings in some virtual gallery that you then ship as part of a game. Right. And let's even take away corporate America from it. Like, let's assume that it's some little indie studio that's doing this thing. Right? Still corporate in some sense, but not answerable to like the lawyers of Blizzard or EA or whatever.
Okay.
Is it okay to do that? Right? Is it okay to generate art using one of these tools, claim it as yours, put it into a piece of software that you then ship?
Yeah, it's interesting because this is part of what you said earlier, where if the AI does something wrong, you can say, "Well, look, it was the AI," but that means how can you take credit for the benefits you get from the AI and the money that you're getting from the AI, but refuse responsibility for any of the negative consequences from the AI? And in this case, right, it seems that I mean, you're selling it. It's, you know, you're making money from it. It seems that you would be but it seems to be different if you've essentially procedurally generated it and then it's kind of a set thing, as opposed to, let's say, every time you run the game, it gives you a different configuration.
Is it different? Why is that different?
Well, because you have control over the final product you're shipping. So if you did it once, right, you can essentially, your QA team can look over the product. But if you're doing it every time, there's no way you can control what's happening there, right? So it seems that you know, in the first case, the AI is a tool for creating the product, but then the product is kind of fully yours. Where in the second version, the AI is creating the product anew every time in some way. Yeah, and that seems to me to make at least some sort of difference with responsibility. Because when it comes to responsibility, we essentially, you know, our common excuses are, I didn't know, and I couldn't control it, right? And, you know, with the first product, if it's just an art gallery, and I'm thinking of something like, instead of a regular art gallery, I'm thinking of something like in BioShock 3, where you have like the racist museum, let's say. And let's say you let the AI like generate some stuff for the racist museum, right? If you had it generated once and then you saw it, at this point, you know, right? You're in control of it. If essentially any time everyone played BioShock 3, they would get a different racist gallery created by an AI, the producers of the game, they couldn't know what was going to be shown, and they would have no control over what is shown.
Well, but they know that they will have no control.
Right.
And they know that someone does have control over the space of things that can be created.
Right.
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 And when we talk about procedural generation or generative design, really what a designer is doing when they create one of these systems is that they're creating a space of potential things.
Right.
Right. And it's sort of the responsibility of the person doing that to understand the space of potential things that they're creating, so that they feel decently confident that some enormous corner of that space isn't going to be horribly racist, right? Unless it's intentional. But in that case, it needs to be racist in the way that you intend it to be for the effect of the social commentary of the game. And that is a that is a really difficult line even for humans to follow with one.
Oh, definitely.
One
Like no
thing.
one would be stupid enough to let an AI actually generate an art
One
gallery
would
like
hope
that.
not,
right?
and yet you would be surprised. Right, because like I think that like that's one of the tricky things about this, right? Like there's some level of sort of promise and hope for what procedural generation will be able to bring, like a different experience every time. Like maybe it's interesting that it's procedural, maybe it's part of the game that it's procedural, where you know you go once and you see one thing, but like another person who's playing sees a different thing, and that's important because then the players get to have a conversation about how they saw different things. I don't know, whatever it is, right?
Right.
But like that can be a really important and intentional piece of design. If you need that as a design element in the game for the kind of experience that you want to be able to create, you also need to be able to accept the responsibility for what happens when that procedural system goes wrong, right? Because you have given it to someone to use and play with. Like you have put your name behind it and said, yes, this is something that I stand behind as appropriate. And so you need to be pretty confident that it's going to be appropriate. Right?
Yeah. And it's really interesting how and again I'm thinking about the kind of the sexist job things on Facebook, how I definitely think those programmers are responsible for the outcome. Though there's a question with that one of whether they should have known whether that was negligent or not. And I think the question of kind of negligence and recklessness, right, is one of those things where knowing what the potential space of the outcome is seems really, really important, and something that programmers would need to give thought to.
Right. And so I guess my argument would be a sufficiently large portion of the population could have easily predicted that as the outcome, right? Like I fully expect that if you take an AI system and you train it on something that we know to be biased, it will replicate and amplify those biases, right? It is simply the nature of machine learning to do that. Like literally that is its strength, right? It identifies patterns that we know about, and it identifies patterns that we don't know about, and drives all decisions made in the system based off of those patterns. Like literally it is what machine learning does. Right?
Let me ask you, based on this, would you say that social media companies like Facebook and Twitter were negligent or reckless in essentially the divisive impact they had on the world, given what those algorithms were, that they should have known from the very beginning?
They should have known. They should have had an audit process to be able to look for it, even if they didn't know, right? Even if you're like, oh, they had this like idea in mind, right? They should have known what they were doing. These are real people. The technical approach is known to have these kinds of emergent effects, right? Even if they didn't have teams of people whose job it is to study how people behave on social media, which they do, right, in their research arms. Even if they didn't have those people, I would argue that they should have had those people, because it is part of their job, right, to facilitate human communication. So they better be working with people who understand human communication, right? Like, yes, at every step of the way, I think social media platforms are responsible for the impact on society that the very design of the platform is like intended to create.
And well, by the very design of the platform, we're talking about the use of AIs in particular to kind of do this.
Sure, any kind of recommendation system, yeah.
Right. Do you see anything like that in the game sphere that would be remotely comparable?
I mean, there's kind of community management type stuff, right, for multiplayer games, and there are some, how do you design a platform to, right? How do you moderate a platform? How do you control for hate speech on your platform? There were for a while. I'm not as sure about the current state of things, but like some AI tools that are used to kind of like monitor and detect toxic behavior in online community spaces. that's definitely an analog.
Yeah, it's interesting how, the AI tools being used to identify versus changing the game or something in response to identifying those patterns, which is what social media does.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, like, a really interesting thing, and I don't know if anyone's doing it, but now I kind of want to, like, after this call, find out if someone's doing it. Is so that there's this idea in cybersecurity of like detecting bad actors and then like intentionally honeypotting them, right? Like, and so this is actually, and I'm not a cybersecurity researcher, so my knowledge, like, I may be explaining this wrong, but the idea behind platforms like Cloudflare, right, which now everyone like routes their internet traffic through Cloudflare for security purposes, right? They initially set up some system of like, what if we could detect the bad actors and like route them this way, right? Okay. And then let everyone else go down the main path, but like we're gonna find the people who are misbehaving and redirect them so they think they're still going down the right path, but actually we're like honeypotting them into this like labyrinth essentially that they'll get kind of trapped in.
Huh. So this is a kind of virtual entrapment.
Yeah, virtual entrapment,
right.
but like for good.
Right. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, yes, virtual entrapment. Yeah, I wonder if people are doing things like that for social media or for like online game playing, right? If you can detect that someone is being a tremendous asshole in your game,
all right,
can you find it and then just have them play AI players so that they still get to be that, right? But like it. Not to other human beings.
This takes us back to the earlier point of identifying or whether the person is a player AI. Maybe sometimes we don't want to identify it because
don't want people to know.
Yeah, that's a great way. So those people who want to grief can essentially still grieve or still feel like they're grieving, but they're grieving against AI,
right?
And no one's getting
hurt. I mean, except to the extent that you're permitting the antisocial behavior, right? Which is longer term harm done. But maybe less, maybe relatively less than. Because no one's getting hurt by it. It's interesting. This is definitely manipulative.
Oh, it's totally manipulative. Right, manipulative for the power of good. Right, we can use AIs for that. No, I mean, manipulation is one of those things that we often talk about as bad. But I'm a parent. I manipulate my child like every other parent.
Yeah, let's look at behavior charts. Like I have a number of those spread across the house for my kids.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Gillian, I think we're about done.
Okay.
So let me ask you this: what final words do you want to leave our listeners with when it comes to AI ethics in games?
I say that someone is always accountable, right? You don't get to hide. Like I would say anytime anyone hears someone say something that seems like it's shifting blame onto an AI system, don't believe them, right? So like someone made that thing, right? For good or for bad. Right, it doesn't get to be the AI's fault or virtue, right? It's always a human behind it. Like AI systems they're not magic. They're a bunch of numbers. People can learn how to make them. It's not that hard. There's always a human wherever there's an AI. So look for the human.
All right, keep looking for those humans. Gillian Smith, thank you so much for coming on our show. Good podcast, GP. Play nice, everybody. You can subscribe and listen to all of our episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.